evening, Demon fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast. My name is Andy, and tonight we're jumping into the DeLorean and winding the clock back 100 years to revisit one of the great chapters in Melbourne Football Club history. Joining us are Whispering Jack and Ian Munro as Ian takes us on a journey through the 1926 season and the road that led the Demons, or should I say the Fuchsias, to the club's second premiership. Ian brings this remarkable period to life, guiding us through the people, the moments, and the story behind that unforgettable day in October that remains forever etched in the history of our club. Ian is a journalist and author and wrote the excellent book Between the Flags, Making Sense of 57 Years of Heartache, which explores the long road from Melbourne's 1964 premiership through to the drought-breaking flag. It's a terrific read. It is available from Readings, The Avenue, and The Demon Shop. So, without further ado, here are Whispering Jack and Ian Munro as they take us back a century to 1926.
Talking with Ian Munro, who's the author of that great book, Between the Flags, Making Sense of 57 Years of Heartache, available from Readings, The Avenue Bookstore, and The Demon Shop. And we're talking about 1926 because it happens to be an event that occurred 100 years ago. History, to my mind, the history of the club is all important. It was brought to mind recently, straight in the new year, when Kane Cornes, on his first radio program, he had a go at Port Adelaide Football Club that he was champion player for, and was complaining that the club was too steeped in its own history, that it was pointing out 100 years of great premierships for Port Adelaide in the past, and it wasn't looking forward. So, Ian, what's the importance of studying history and understanding it?
Well, first of all, I've got some sympathy for Kane Cornes' view because I went through 57 years of looking back. All that time when Melbourne were unsuccessful, the only consolation we had was thinking about everything that had gone before that period. But I remember also Danny Corcoran, when he arrived at Melbourne, saying they were this little club that was always looking back to this greatness. And his point was we weren't building to anything in the current period. And that's certainly a trap, I think, to be always looking back and taking consolation in that. But I think it's also important to understand where your clubs come from and to respect the people who have bled for it in the past. And I think it's also really valuable when a young player comes into a club like Melbourne, they know there's this long history of success and achievement. And, 1926, it's 100 years ago, so there are no witnesses to it who are still alive, and there are clearly no players from it, but it was still a momentous event in the club's development. And when you examine it and look at how they built up to that achievement, you can see that it was a template for Melbourne's golden era, because we have to remember Melbourne was defunct for 3 years during the First World War. In fact, there are only 4 clubs in the competition in 1916, and that was Carlton, Collingwood, Richmond and Fitzroy for the record. The other clubs, South Melbourne, Geelong, St Kilda, Essendon, came back over the next 2 years. Melbourne was the last to rejoin in 1919. They had only one player who had previously been on the list playing in 1919. They did not win a game until round 1, 1920. They won only a handful of games for those next few years. But what happens, and you see this in 1924, 25, 26, they go into the country, they start recruiting country players. Bunny Whitman's a prominent example. And they build up this team. 9 of the 18 premiership players from 1926 were recruited in 3 seasons, 24, 25, 26, or they debuted in those 3 seasons. So this then becomes the way Melbourne succeed right through the 40s, 50s and 60s. Country players, concerted recruiting, finding jobs for players, that was really important, which they do through the coterie. And this is the first time the club's able to do it. You don't want to dismiss any premiership, but the thing we won in 1900 was a bit of a quirky result because the finals had this very strange round-robin finals campaign. We finished 6th in a competition of 8 clubs, and because of the quirks of the round-robin, ended up in a grand final and beat Fitzroy and won our first flag. But we were by no means the dominant side. A lot of people regard that as a bit of a fluke, and it was for that reason that the final system was changed in future. And so I think we can look at 1926 as the benchmark for what followed, and it's also worth keeping in mind or understanding it because there are so many legends of the club like Chadwick and Warren Smith who were part of it.
All right, so 1926, for those of you who are good at arithmetic, is actually 100 years ago. So this is the centenary of the club's second premiership and probably, as Ian says, the first fair income premiership that the club won. Although, we'll keep 1900 because it was a good, nice round figure, the start of the century, and for 2/3 of that century we did quite well.
Well, the other thing I'd just interpose, Jack, is that it was a victory over Collingwood in the grand final in 1926, and you always want to soak those up.
And we did stop Collingwood from winning 5 in a row because they won the next 4.
Best not thought of that. In fact, they did get, while you mentioned that, they did get their revenge against us. 2 years later, we played them in a semi-final. We drew the first final, and they beat us by 4 points in the second. And that was on their way to the second of those premierships. But let's not talk about that.
Well, we won't talk about that, but if you look at history, and I always speak to people about history and say it's not just about the date 1926, but it's about how you built up to that premiership in 26. So we had a very good year. I don't believe we were the absolute top side that year, but close. But we made our premiership from the final series. But the build-up came from 1923 Wooden Spooners, 1924 finishing second last, and then really taking off in 1925, playing in the finals for the first time. So we obviously recruited well. It was quicker build-up. There are some clubs in the AFL that talk about a 5 or 6 year period to build their lists to be good enough to contest a final series. So how did Melbourne do it in the period from 23 when they were stone motherless last to premiership in 26?
Well, they did take 4 or 5 years, actually, I think, if you look at it. You get key players in the back line like Thomas, Coy, Streeter, come in 1920, 1921. So you've got a kind of a spine there. You've got Bert Chadwick coming in 1920. Warren Smith has a year at 1919. So there is a core of players around which they built this success. Dick Taylor, 1922. Fantastic wingman by all accounts. So it does take 5 or 6 years to put this group together, but it tends to come in a rush. The one key player I think who comes in 1926 is Bob Johnson, 6'3", a giant of his time, and for those who are metrically inclined, that's 192 centimetres. So players were by no means the same size then as they are now. 192 centimetres was a giant. He was normally the biggest man on the ground. He was a superb mark. He had a great leap, and he dominated for Melbourne at centre-half forward. I think he was the missing element that wasn't there in 1925 when they went down to Collingwood in a final after beating the top side Geelong in the first final. Pop Fine, everyone remembers him because he played his first game in the grand final. But if you read the match reports, he had an immediate impact and was a strong mark. I think he was around 6'2", so a little bit shorter than Johnson, but they were relative giants in the game. It's worth keeping in mind too, the tallest player Collingwood had to put against Johnson at the time, at the start of the match, was Albert Collier, who was 5'10". So they were at a bit of a disadvantage. But that was because their centre-half back, guy called Claydon, had belted Johnson in the last quarter of the semi-final, and was suspended for 8 weeks as a result. And it amazes me to think here's a player in a final being suspended for 8 weeks. It just would not happen these days.
Yes, it probably should have happened a few years ago when Angus Brayshaw was belted, but I don't think we can talk about that. They certainly didn't have match review panels back in those days, did they?
No, I don't think they did. No. They had a player's advocate who could put a case for a player as a sort of defence. Yeah, put a defence on the player's behalf, but I think that's all they had. Certainly had no vision.
Did they have any rules? This sort of a strike is worth X amount of weeks? Or?
Not that I know of, because if you look at the variation, famously in the preliminary final of 1926, the Melbourne centreman Bob Corbett we used to use the expression king hit just on half time, and his jaw was broken in 2 places. And the fellow who hit him, ironically, surname of May, was suspended for the entire 1927 season. I think you could just make up your penalty just like today. Just pick one out of the box.
100 years ago, almost on the 1st of May 1926, Melbourne played its round 1 game, and by some coincidence, the opponent was the St Kilda Football Club. Just like 2026, and the result in that opening match was a resounding Melbourne victory. So how's that for an omen? What do you think of that, Ian?
I respect your search for an omen, and who knows, we may just see it fulfilled at the end of the year, but if not, it's still going to be a very interesting year for the Demons because there's a lot of excitement around the place. As it was in 1926, there was a sense of expectation going into that season. I think we might have mentioned previously, Melbourne had their first finals campaign in a decade in 1925, beat the top side Geelong in a semi-final, but then lost to Collingwood in a prelim pretty badly. And in fact, it was that game that convinced Bert Chadwick that Melbourne needed to be a more vigorous side in 1926 and that they had to bring a bit more physicality into their game. They were renowned, like Geelong, as a fast, skilled side that liked playing in open space out on the wings. Collingwood had adopted a policy from the 1925 season onwards of avoiding the wings because, believe it or not, Jack, and I know you obviously love an omen, there was a new rule brought in 1925 which gave a free kick to the opposition when the ball went over the boundary line from if it was forced or kicked over. We've got a similar rule this year. So that's just adding to your omen list.
Well,
does that excite you a little bit more?
It does a bit, but I bet they didn't have a 50-metre arc back in those days.
No, they didn't have a 50-metre arc, you're right. So, yeah, but it's a similar sort of thing. But, yeah, Melbourne went into that season, I think, pretty excited, but with, as I say, Chadwick's determination to bring more physicality into the team. And we saw that. I think there was a very notable game around round 13 against Carlton, which Melbourne won. They won. It was at the MCG. They were almost undefeated at the MCG in 1926. They lost just one game. We can talk about that perhaps. But round 13 against Carlton was a really tough, hard-fought contest. And the Age made a point of noting Melbourne's vigour and matching bump for bump. And it was about then, I think, that perhaps Chadwick realised that he'd built something that could go a bit further than Melbourne had gone before.
And talking about Chadwick had been appointed at the beginning of 1925 to replace the previous coach who had a relatively unsuccessful career as the coach of Melbourne. So Chadwick takes the reins in 25 and there's an automatic improvement. What was it about Chadwick that made him the ultimate premiership coach in 1926?
Oh, I think that some credit has to go to his secretary, Andrew Manzi, I think it was.
The club secretary, yes.
Yeah, who was doing the recruiting and who was travelling over Victoria, going out to Rosedale, for example, in Gippsland to pick up Bunny Whitman. So credit's got to go there. He was recruiting, but it was Chadwick who fashioned the game style, and it was Chadwick in semi-final against Collingwood who changed the game's style of play, got the Demons going wide. They were, I think, 22 points down at half-time of the semi-final, and it was Chadwick who directed the players to where to kick the ball, take it wide to the wings, run Collingwood off their legs. They like to play up the middle to avoid the wings because of that rule brought in 1925, and Melbourne exploited the space that was available to them.
Chadwick was a playing coach?
Playing coach, that's right, yeah. Captain coach, as was pretty typical in those days, and would direct the team on field and make positional changes on field as well. He was responsible for all of that.
Did he get paid more for being the playing coach, or?
I have no idea. You didn't get paid a lot at Melbourne.
No.
We tended to be minimalist in what we paid.
And that was probably one of our problems over the years, particularly after our golden era of 1964, that a lot of the other clubs became more professional in the way they ran affairs at the club and paid players, and we seemed to miss out on recruiting.
Well, we had a tradition of amateur recruitment, amateur players, and we took pride in having amateurs. And even back in the 20s, players were relying on match payments or whatever, a lot of that period, but they were relying on match payments or expenses covered by the club to feed their kids. It was a really tough time. And I think that might explain the success of clubs like Collingwood, Richmond in that era, Fitzroy as well, were hugely successful. Those industrial working class suburbs produced very successful sides.
And speaking of industrial working class suburbs, from what suburb was the club that actually beat Melbourne at the MCG in that year? You mentioned
Collingwood.
Thought so. So they were the bane of our existence.
They were our nemesis. That year, 1926, Melbourne won all but one game at the MCG, and they won pretty much at every ground except Princes Park, Victoria Park, where they lost by 7 points, a creditable loss, and Corio lost down at Geelong as well. Again, quite a close game. But everything at the MCG, apart from one game against Collingwood, which they lost by 50 points, was a win. Some interesting things happened that year. It was, I think, only the second year North Melbourne had been in the competition, and their supporters still needed to be civilised. One of our prime defenders, Jimmy Abernethy, was lucky to survive his first or second visit to Arden Street when a half brick was thrown at his head from across the boundary line at the gasometer wing.
Well, I can vouch for one thing. Nothing much changed at Arden Street over a long period of time, even for spectators, because I can remember attending the Arden Street Oval perhaps in the early 70s, and I think one of those bricks was still being thrown around. So nothing changes.
Well, I was on leaving Arden Street after Jim Tilbrook had saved us from defeat with two mighty torpedo punt goals in the last quarter. I was warned by my father not to say a word if I wanted to maintain my teeth. And that was pretty much the atmosphere at Arden Street, as late as 1969, 1970.
Remember it well.
But, as for 1926, Melbourne was successful right through the competition. They were renowned as a very strong third quarter side, which proved the case in the grand final as well, but also a highly skilled side.
Just getting back to the concept of industrial suburbs and what have you, there's a belief that Melbourne were considered the toffs of the competition, and Collingwood were the working class team that represented the people working in the factories of that inner northern suburbs. Was that really the case?
Well, certainly Collingwood was an industrial suburb, and the Collingwood Football Club was basically created by popular demand. The original club in Collingwood was called Britannia, and the suburb rebelled. They wanted a club called Collingwood. And so Collingwood was created out of those people who lived and worked in Collingwood. And it did represent a working class suburb. If you read some of the Collingwood histories, the Collingwood players didn't look at Melbourne as toffs. They just looked at them as opponents. And an interesting history by Richard Stremski, who interviewed some of the Collingwood players of that era, said they didn't have that view of Melbourne. That view of Melbourne, the players thought, was created by the press at the time. So it was a way of dressing up the contest in a way that readers could relate to.
So you're saying the media haven't changed either?
No. And it's good, isn't it? Consistency.
Except in those days they didn't have television, which is helpful. These days we can watch a different program and get different points of view on the game every night of the week virtually from different pundits. What was it like back in those days? How was it communicated and how was the game seen?
It was communicated through the press. What's interesting is that the press did not have the hands-off view of criticising actions by players on field that they sometimes seem to have now. So when Corbett was felled in the preliminary final in 1926, the Sporting Globe headline was "A Disgraceful Act." And when Johnson was belted in the second semi-final, the author in the Argus had a long article in which he first of all criticised the attack on Johnson, but then called for a second Collingwood player to be reported, which he wasn't, but said he should have been reported for an attack on Melbourne ruckman Colin Dean that left him with stop marks in the back. So the press didn't hold back. They saw what they saw. They were the only witnesses to it who were being noted, and they wrote down their impressions. And I guess it was subjective in a sense, and there wasn't the film to back them up. They were not reluctant to give their opinion as to what they thought was going on.
One of the crowning features, apart from winning a premiership, was that the club also produced the Brownlow Medalist of the Year in 1926, and that was Ivor Warne-Smith, who won the first of two. So he was the first dual winner when he won it again in 1928. But Warne-Smith was an interesting player. He was actually born in Sydney, which is interesting because in those days, most of us came from the traditional states, Victoria, South Australia, WA and Tasmania. Warne-Smith enlisted in the war in 1915, served briefly at Gallipoli and then in France, and returned to Australia in March 1919. He was immediately invited to play football with the Melbourne Football Club and spent a short period there, came back, as has been mentioned, in 1925 and made a big difference to the club in 26, where they had a system of one vote only was given by the umpires to the best player on the ground, or best and fairest player on the ground. Warne-Smith won that award, and he was the vice-captain of the club in 1926 and wore the number 14. Despite having just played 26 games, he was made the vice-captain and was also on the selection committee. He acted as captain because of the absence of Bert Chadwick for 8 matches through injury. It was a fair effort from Ivor Warne-Smith, one of the first champions of the club.
And I'd probably guess that had the voting system been the same then as it is now, that a very close runner-up to Warne-Smith in the Brownlow or in any voting would have been Stan Whitman. To read the match reports through 1926 is to just read a litany of praise for Whitman's skill, his elusiveness, his impact on the game. He was clearly a star of his time, an outstanding player who would probably have had more recognition if there'd been a 3-2-1 system rather than just the single vote.
And the story of Whitman's recruitment at the club was quite interesting. The club secretary was apparently on a tram somewhere around the Hawthorn area, and the tram conductor tipped him off that there was a player playing out near Bairnsdale, Rosedale area called Bunny Whitman, and he would do well to invite him to the club. And Manzi was quite an astute club secretary. He went out and visited this budding champion, brought him in for some practice and liked what he saw. I think Whitman wanted to go home though, but they did manage, thankfully, to convince him. And really from the very beginning of his career in 1924, he was a goal kicker, very clever on his toes and quite spectacular without being a big tall mark. He was one of the more elegant players of his day.
And this is a time when players would kick a goal on the run with a drop kick rather than a drop punt. If they weren't using a place kick, it was quite common to drop kick for goal. And that's a skill which no longer exists in the game. We had a fine exponent, I think it was Tassie Johnson, who used to drop kick out from fullback to the centre of the MCG.
Yes, and that was a wonder to behold. So these days, Melbourne are known as the Demons, but 100 years ago they went by a flowery name, the Fuchsias, or the Redlegs.
There were two nicknames for Melbourne at the time, Redlegs and Fuchsias. Demons came in 1933 with Checker Hughes.
Because Checker Hughes thought that Fuchsias, being the name of a flower, was somewhat timid for a VFL football team. So he decided to put some fire into the club, and it took a few years, but it actually worked. And just as in March of this year, the Demons kick off proceedings with a win against St Kilda, the Fuchsias do the same in 1926. After that, however, they lose two of the next three to Carlton and Collingwood before they go on to win 5 in a row, meeting their match against Geelong after that long trek to Corio Oval, and it was a very long one back in those days. They lose only one more game from then on. That's the return match against Collingwood, their only defeat for the year at the MCG. The Fuchsias finish in third place on the ladder with 14 wins out of 18, a game behind the minor premiers Collingwood and Geelong. All three finished with percentages in the high 140s, ahead of Essendon on 12 wins and ahead of South Melbourne on percentage. It's a Finals 4 system, so the Swans are out. In the first week of the finals, Essendon surprised Geelong in their semi-final, and a week later, Melbourne, with an 8-goal third quarter, shocked Collingwood by 11 points in the other semi. The two semi-final winners play off a week later, with Melbourne sneaking in by 3 points in a low-scoring game, which sets the scene under the prevailing final system for the major premiers to challenge it in the grand final. So, after years in the wilderness, Melbourne, which finished last in 1923, second last in 1924, made a final in 25, is now playing off for a flag against Collingwood. And this is the beginning of a rivalry that will never end, but will be at the forefront of the VFL for the next 4 decades.
The way the system worked, first played third, second played fourth. They were called, these were both semi-finals. The losers were eliminated unless they were the top side. The VFL wanted to reward the team that was the minor premier. So they created a system in about 1902 where if you were the top side and you lost your final, you went through to the grand finals anyway. The two losers were eliminated, and depending on how those games went, there would be either 1 or 2 finals to complete it. Give you an example, Jack, and this should tear the heart out of any St Kilda sympathisers out there. 1913, Fitzroy first played Collingwood third in the first final. Fitzroy won. In the second final, St Kilda, who finished fourth, beat South Melbourne, who'd finished second. This meant St Kilda had won the right to play Fitzroy, and the Saints beat Fitzroy, the top side, by 25 points. But under this system, where the top side inevitably got a second chance, Fitzroy was able to challenge St Kilda to a second final, and Fitzroy won that. So St Kilda's premiership wait had to go on for another 53 years, but they had the premiership in their grasp under that system. So it gave this massive advantage to the team finishing first. 1926, Collingwood finished first, Melbourne a third, Melbourne win. All that means is Melbourne get to play a prelim, Collingwood will go through to the grand final automatically. Then we played Essendon, as you mentioned, and made it through. So grand final week 1926. All the portents are for Collingwood to win. Significant, fewer people turned up to the Melbourne-Collingwood final than turned up for the Essendon and Geelong match. Melbourne had a terrible record against Collingwood. We'd won something like 10 out of 64 contests, and we had only once beaten Collingwood in consecutive matches, and that was back in 1922, I think, 21-22. So when we won the final against Collingwood, which was a shock, no one really expected Melbourne to win the second match. More so when storms arrived in the state, middle of the week, thunderstorms right through Victoria. Farmers were said to be very happy. The cricketers were upset. It was the grand final day was October 9. It was supposed to be the first day of the cricket season. Most of the cricket was washed out because the storms that had begun on Wednesday and continued through to Saturday morning had just ruined the pitches and the outfields. So when people are arriving for the grand final, they're assuming a heavy track. They're assuming that's going to suit Collingwood. Collingwood want a congested contest game. Melbourne want a fast, open game. So we're at complete odds in every respect as to how we want to play this game. Melbourne have got more height. Remember, Collingwood have lost their fullback and their centre-half back to injury and reports or suspensions respectively. Melbourne have got this big bloke, Frank Vine, who's coming in for his first game, about 6'2". They've got Bob Johnson, 6'3", and a great leap. We'll dominate the air, but it's going to be wet. Morning of the game, all the focus is on what the state of the ground is. Luckily, it is a bit of a quagmire in the centre and around the goals, but the rest of it is in pretty good condition. Melbourne start really well. Collingwood have a problem. They've lost their key defenders, so they play a bloke called Albert Collier, who becomes a famous Collingwood champion over the next few years, as their main defender against Bob Johnson. Problem, Collier's 5'10", Johnson's 6'3", and Johnson's got a leap. So Johnson dominates early. Has a goal within the first 60 seconds. Multiple goals before half-time. So the Collingwood captain, a bloke called Tyson, takes Collier off and puts himself on Johnson just before half-time and realises, I think, that's not going to work either. So Melbourne have dominated the first quarter. Collingwood come back in the second, but Melbourne still lead by 9 points at half-time, and the game is in the balance. The common view amongst spectators and the press was expressed by an opposition player the year before Melbourne played that famous semi-final against Collingwood in 1925. There was a quote in the press from an unknown player, "Collingwood will smash in and Melbourne will fold," or words to that effect. That was the expectation, and that was exactly against that sort of impression that Chadwick had been building all year to put more vigour into the Melbourne team. Everything that happens in the third quarter is against expectation. Melbourne starts scoring as soon as the game restarts. Harry Moyes, I think, kicks 2 quick goals. Collingwood get one back. Moyes gets another. And then there's this period of 6 minutes in which Melbourne kick 4 goals. A key part of Melbourne's breakaway in the third quarter is the fact that Collingwood changed their tactics against Warren Smith. He had 2 opponents for the first half, the Collingwood centreman plus Sid Coventry playing effectively a kick behind the play, but around the middle. That diminished Warren Smith's impact. But Collingwood restructured at half-time. Sid Coventry was put on to Johnson, a massive headache for Collingwood. Beveridge went to a half-forward flank, and suddenly Warren Smith's got a different opponent and he's cutting up the ground himself. He became dominant and Melbourne were able to take control of the game. Pop Vine scored a goal from a long shot. Warren Smith found a bloke called Dave Duff. Now, Dave Duff's interesting. He was full forward in the grand final team, only played 11 games for Melbourne, kicked 26 goals. Could have been anything. But at the end of the year, he went to Ballarat, where he kicked 304 goals, I think, in 71 games over the next few years. But Dave Duff is full forward on the day. He grabs a couple. Suddenly, this system Melbourne had, which was the wingman Dick Taylor, combining with the half-forward Bunny Whitman, they were a constant headache for opposition teams, and Whitman and Taylor and Harry Moyes, this forward where they've recruited from St Kilda, just take over in the third quarter. Significant part of Melbourne's success that year is that we had a three-pronged attack. So there was Johnson in his first year, Harry Moyes, who was a St Kilda player for several years and quite experienced, and Davey. They all kick 50 goals or more. So that is a key part of Melbourne's success, although Davey is injured and doesn't play on the day, and his place is taken by Dave Duff, as I mentioned. But by the end of that third quarter, Melbourne had an iron grip on the cup. In the words of the press at the time, Melbourne succeeded through a series of lightning passes, White to Whitman to Moyes to Johnson, for their 14th goal. They swept all opposition aside and in 6 wonderful minutes took charge of the game. Carlton talk about having a premiership quarter because they did something to Collingwood in 1970 that was remarkable. But 1926, Melbourne had their own premiership quarter, the third quarter. It may have been the original premiership quarter because from that point there was no doubt on who was going to win the game. The only point of interest was whether the Collingwood full forward, Gordon Coventry, could kick a record number of goals in a season. He went into the game with 81 goals. The record was 82. It took him to halfway through the final quarter to get his 83rd goal. He was completely dominated by the Melbourne fullback, Harry Coy, who was an experienced player, had about 5 or 6 years under his belt. And that was almost the only point of interest in the last quarter, whether Coventry would get his record. The day was an absolute momentous occasion for Melbourne. It was so big, it resulted in an entirely new verse in the team song. It capped a year in which Ivor Warne-Smith had won the Brownlow medal, the first of 2, and the team had dominated on almost every venue in the competition. Perhaps above all, you would say that the premiership belonged to Bert Chadwick because he engineered the team's style. He was the one who guided their recovery in the semi-final against Collingwood. He was the one who held the back line together and directed play and directed tactics in terms of use of pace, open play and skilled football. It was, according to observers at the time, the finest exhibition of football in the game's history.
How did they celebrate winning the grand final in 1926?
Well, to begin, I think they drove around the city in open-topped cars after the game. Straight after the game, they're chaired off the ground. There's a sort of semi-riot, great merriment, joyous celebration at the ground. Among the people to witness this amazing event, one of the so-called fathers of the game, Henry Harrison, was there to witness his old club, about to turn 90 years old in a week's time, as was Dick Wardle, who was the captain of the 1900 Premiership team. Yeah, that's sort of scenes you'd expect after the game, with people cheering the players off the ground, surrounding them, cheering, singing the song. Melbourne later drove through the city in open-top cars. They ended the night at midnight at a milk bar in Bentley, which was operated by the Dunbar family. The centre-half back from the Premiership team, Hugh Dunbar, was the third of 3 Dunbar boys to play for Melbourne. His older brothers had played as well, and that's where they finished off on the Saturday night into Sunday morning. They partied in the style of the time by having a smoke night on Monday night in the pavilion at the MCG. They'd expected about 200 people to turn up. It was a kind of a pre-planned social, which turned into a victory dinner, and I think they had about 400 turn up at the night, so they had to make extra room.
So do we know the address of that milk bar? Because
I'd love to know.
we could perhaps turn up. Although I think if it still exists as a shop, it's probably one of these trendy cafes. So perhaps if one of our listeners can do a bit of digging, we might meet there after our next premiership.
It did occur to me that we could start by looking at the electoral roll for 1926 because often people lived above or behind the milk bar they operated. So that may well be the Dunbar family residence. If we check the electoral roll
Right.
for 1926, look up Dunbar, we might be able to find it.
All right. Well, that's a good tip. And we know that the premiership flag from 1926 went missing, I've been told, and there is a reproduction at the MCG of that flag. But if anyone ever finds that flag, if they could return it to the Demonland head office, and we'll make sure that the club gets it. What happened to us after 26?
The next year, 27, they'd have expected to kick on just as probably we did after 21. Basically, the season came undone with a series of injuries late in the year. Melbourne were in the top four until about 3 weeks before the finish. They'd had some bad losses to Collingwood and Geelong after winning 8 of the first 10. And then I think late in the year, round 16, there was a loss to Fitzroy, who at that stage were struggling. And that tipped us out of the four. Carlton took our spot. We won the last 2 games against Footscray and Hawthorn, but were unable to get back in. Returned to the finals in 1928, finishing third. As I think I mentioned previously, we drew a final against Collingwood, who'd finished on top, 9 goals, 8 apiece, and had a replay. They kicked 10-8, and I think we kicked 9-12 or something of that order in the replay, almost identical scores. And so we lost by 4 points. The next couple of years, we finished 5th, just missing the finals on percentage, and then went into a slide which was not reversed until Checker Hughes turned up 1933, and I think we returned to finals about 3 years after that.
And became Demons.
That was Whispering Jack and Ian Munro, and what a fascinating chapter of our club's proud history they've just taken us through. Ian will be back in 13 years' time to chronicle the next premiership, the one that we won in 1939, and I'm already looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us on this trip into the distant past as we revisited a part of Melbourne's story that in many ways has almost faded with time. Let's hope the Demons can add a few more history-making moments of their own again before too long. Go Fuchsias. Go Demons.
Go Redleggers.
It's a grand old flag, it's a high-flying flag, it's an emblem for me and for you. It's the emblem of the team we love, the team of the red and the blue. Every heart beats true for the red and the blue, as we sing a song for you. Should old acquaintance be forgot, keep your eye on the red and the blue. Where the team played fine in the year 39, we're the team that no one can lick. And you'll find us there after the final bell with the spirit of 1926. Every heart beats true for the red and the blue, as we sing this on